Welcome. I'm Nanette Carter, Program Curator for the exhibition Creating Community Zinke Gallery Artists, which is taking place at the Art Students League from May 3rd to July 4th in their Phyllis Harriman Mason Gallery. Our panel today is titled Constructing Black Cultural Institutions During the 60s Civil Rights Movement. And our panelists are Adger Cowans, photographer and an original member of Kamoinge Photography Collective, established in 1963. Eric Pryor, CEO and president of the Harlem School of the Arts, established in 1964. Pat Hinds, who was a board member for over 20 years at Zinke Gallery, established in 1969. And our moderator is Greg Tate, musician and cultural critic. Thank you all.
Well, greetings all. Good to be here with this esteemed panel. And I'll start off by saying that I recall as the 60s became the 70s, when I was but a wee child, there was a battle cry in the community to institutionalize the movement and the culture. And we saw that take many forms very rapidly in the late 60s, early 70s. And in terms of, I guess, seniority of institutions, it would be great to start with you, Patricia, talking about Cinque and what the thinking was among that group of artists, what compelled them politically, artistically, to form the organization.
Well, I first met Romeo Bearden probably several years after it was the gallery was formed. It was formed with Romeo Bearden, Norman Lewis, Ernie Critchlow, and their mission was to support Black artists and give them a platform and a arena to actually show their work. So when I first met Romy and his wife, Nanette, I was introduced to them. I was taken to their home by an old friend of mine, Frank Stewart, who some of you may know, and developed a rapport with both of them. During that same period, which was probably the late 70s, I think, I was also lecturing in the history of Black American art at the Brooklyn Museum with the 2 Centuries of Black American Art exhibit, where I met lots of the artists and some who became really good friends over the years. Ed Clark, Al Loving, Joe Delaney. I knew a lot of the artists, and also I was one of the founding members of Enzyma Society, which was an organization. We lasted about 10 years, and during that time, we supported arts and cultural institutions, including Cinque Gallery, and provided money to about 6 figures over those 10 years to a host of the cultural institutions, including the Studio Museum in Harlem, which we gave a Betty Saar altarpiece. We bought a Betty Saar altarpiece to be donated to the museum's permanent collection. And the Dance Theater of Harlem, the Studio Museum I mentioned, the Harlem School of the Arts, the Billie Holiday Theater, the Negro Ensemble Company, Schomburg Library. So during that time, there was a group of women in the media who put our collective forces together to support with an annual event. It was a auction and bazaar, which a lot of people came and supported and came to know about some of the organizations and give additional support. So the gallery, with the mission of supporting artists through exhibiting the work, and is particularly emerging artists, through the years, gave artist in resident grants and supported through different locations. We started down at Joe Papp's Theater the Public Theater, although I wasn't on the board during that time when it was founded. I was still in school at the time. I wasn't asked to join the board until probably a decade after it was in existence, but I stayed on the board for, close to probably 20 years. And there was a core group of people with the gallery who gave to support the mission, which was an incredible mission for the artists and was most appreciated. And the artists gave back and supported the gallery. The core group was obviously Ernie Critchlow, who was the only living member at the time, and Ruth Jett, who was the backbone of the gallery. She was there in thick and thin through all the locations. She was a good friend of the founders, and she gave blood, sweat, and tears to keep the gallery going. And that mission continued for another few years after I left, but it was an important mission. And I think the legacy, is here. It continues, all of the work and the support for the arts community and for specifically artists who exhibited and had a place at Zinke Gallery for many years.
So I was thinking that for contemporary younger people don't know a New York art world where Black artists are in many of the major institutions now. They're in the Chelsea galleries. It's pretty normalized, I think, for them, and even for those who are emergent among them, to have places in those galleries, those places like the Whitney and the Guggenheim and so forth. So I wonder if you could talk about the kind of exclusion and erasure and indifference to Black artists that perhaps existed and compelled Cinque into being, in the 70s.
Well, there weren't platforms for artists to exhibit. There were, I don't know, if there were any others. I don't think probably. If so, there weren't many. There were other venues that we used. We had shows in Sag Harbor to support the artists. We had at people's homes, private collections. So the gallery was an extension, a community and an extension, not only in its own space, which was first downtown, then we were on 72nd Street for many years. We were across on the west side for a short period of time until we were able to move to Soho, to 560 Broadway, where we stayed for the last years. But it was a unique place because it was totally to support the artist. It was nonprofit. It wasn't to make money. The money that was made or collected went back into the gallery and back into supporting the artists, which was very unique.
Yeah. Were there formal workshops organized to discuss issues of sustaining a career in the art world?
Well, we had programs. We had various programs over the years, with different topics, and for to further educate not only artists, but to people who supported the artists in ways that the mission might be extended. But the gallery, the platform that was given for artists to be able to show their work was immensely important for so many, because there weren't other places where the Black artists' work could be shown. Cinque focused very often on emerging artists to give those artists a platform that they would not have anyplace else.
I must say, the only people I recall in the 70s who were exhibiting in galleries were Romare Bearden, Ed Clark, I believe, was at Randall Gallery. Mm-hmm. Maybe in the 80s, then we had Howard Dina at Lerner Heller. So again, people being represented by galleries. Bearden was the only one I recall, really, and Ed Clark. I believe Whitfield Lavelle had his first solo show at the gallery. And of course, we all know he's received a MacArthur.
Yes.
Shows with DC Moore Gallery in Chelsea. I can tell you that Bill Hudson had his first New York show at the gallery. He had just come back from Paris. He'd been living in Paris. And the way he tells me is that his last show in New York was at Zinke Gallery. So his first and last show were there. And I believe he did have a show at the Student Museum of Harlem, which I believe opened in 1968, 69. So this is all in the 60s, which is just incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. Eric, I'd like to bring you in.
Okay.
To talk about Harlem School of the Arts and that founding and that legacy and ongoing contribution to my neighborhood up here in Washington Heights, Sugar Hill.
Well, Greg, thank you, and Nanette, and every Adger. And it's great to see all of you guys. HSA was founded in 1964 by renowned opera singer Dorothy Maynard. We were founded next door at St. James Presbyterian Church. Dorothy Maynard's husband, Shelby Rooks, was the leader of the church. He was the, I guess I would call him pastor, but I don't think that was the title they used. But Dorothy had retired. She was Miss Maynard, I should say, was a peer of Marian Anderson's. And it's interesting, I was reading some history and it was almost critical of her, and they called her, she was more concerned with being domestic is how they described it, because she had a husband and she wanted to do arts education. And so they felt like Marian Anderson, she had to sing. And so she was able to just, I guess, reach her full potential as a vocalist, as a opera singer. And when I look at, them to call Dorothy Maynard a domestic, she was an institution builder. And she had vision and understood that, at a certain point, that was her priority, was to build an institution where Black children could come and learn all these various art forms with people who look like them, the people that understood the history of the aesthetic of where these children were coming from. And similar to Cinque, I can only imagine right now, and even though there are a lot of artists showing in mainstream galleries right now, there's still a lot of our emerging artists that don't have platforms, even to this day. So in the 60s, I know it had to be the case. And it was really about, I think, in Ms. Maynard's instance, she felt like Black and brown children in Harlem needed the arts to navigate American society. She felt like it would equip them in terms of their, just who they were as human beings and their development, right, in a way that they could deal with, the shifts you have to make as Black people. When you were in certain spaces, you would want to be able to act a little bit. You'd want to be able to control and understand, read the room, because as we know, at various events like Emmett Till and other things that happened during that period of time, if you didn't know where you were and could read situations, it could literally cost you your life. So I think that those who understood, like Dorothy Maynard and Romy Bearden and Ernie Critchlow and Norman Lewis and others, as Nanette mentioned, the Studio Museum at that time, they understood the power of the arts and understood agency for the Black community meant controlling our cultural narrative. And the only way you control your cultural narrative is that you have folks who are from it making those selections. Who will they exhibit? With what frequency it will occur? Providing that platform. And the scary part is, being president of Harlem School of the Arts, right? It's not much different right now. In terms of, there are those people who get plucked and sort of get put into a certain situation but there are a lot of folks that won't get seen, or, the question becomes, as Nanette mentioned, she was on, I think, the Artistic Council, was it called, Nanette, or Artistic Board? How do we ensure that there are people who understand the legacy of our culture and can make those kind of decisions to make certain that the next generation of artists that need and should be lifted are lifted and given that platform? So I see it all intertwined. I see, what happened in the 60s is all being intertwined. And like, for example, with us, when we first started, our Children's Arts Carnival was at HSA. So Dorothy Maynard knew Betty Blayton Taylor, and Betty was involved with Romy. So all of these folks knew one another and understood what they were doing. And I think that in some instances, they were lucky in that they had opportunities to own space, which gave gave a lifeline that went farther out because you could be entrepreneurial with it. And in other instances, some of our esteemed institutions were subject to the generosity or the foresight of a landlord. And we all know where that can get you at times in New York City. I just feel we're blessed that Dorothy Maynard, and she didn't buy and build the building that we're in into the early 70s. So just to put it in context, understood, one of the perils of, in terms of keeping an institution going, was to have ownership and have that dominion over your space. And so we were fortunate in that way. But I think at the same time, Cinque being in Soho, being in the action, was critical. I mean, I think that would have been a different kind of lift around ownership there, in the community and where it blossomed. I wasn't there at that time. Similar to you, Greg, I was a wee lad in the 60s. But I just thank God that we have their shoulders to stand on, and we can build off of that legacy, because I think many of our young artists, many of us, need to understand, where we come from and become an extension, opposed to trying to just be great in our own moment, but recognize how we connect back.
Well, Eric, describe HSA as a space. Tell us about the programming that goes on there and the range of disciplines, and maybe a little something about pedagogy and faculty.
Okay. Well, as a space, we are 37,000 square feet. We have 3 dance studios. The dance studios were designed, Miss Maynard knew everybody. She was the first African-American on the board of the Met, so she knew Balanchine, who was heading who selected Arthur Mitchell to dance. I think it was ABT at the time. So we had 3 dance studios, 12 private lesson music studios, 5 ensemble rooms. So we have a plethora of training space. But what has always been exciting to me, and one of the things exciting about HSA, is we also have performance space. We have an outdoor courtyard. We have our atrium, which is called Dorothy Maynard Hall, which can fit over 100 people. And I should just say, just recently, we just went through a $9.5 million renovation. So all the acoustics in that space are to die for. I mean, it's all at the top level. And then we also have a 130-seat black box theater. And so with that, we're able to do things. We're able to, I think, we're able to work with emerging artists. We have partnerships with Afro-Latin Jazz Alliance. They've done things here. They were in residence here. We also work with the Harlem Chamber Players. They do a lot of their work here. We've done things with them in residence here. So we've had, so what it's allowed us to do is work with groups that have the highest level performing arts professionals, give them a platform where they can work out new works. And then ultimately our interest and their interest, and then they can present them here at HSA. We do music, of course, Ms. Maynard, that's where we started. That was our root initial thing we did. We do dance. Our first director of dance that worked under Ms. Maynard was Arthur Mitchell before he founded Dance Theater of Harlem. Then we also do theater. And last was visual art, and that was more recently, and that largely was because at that time, Children's Arts Carnival was handling the visual arts. And Miss Maynard and Betty Blayton, they knew one another. They knew what was going on Later on, as Art Carnival had its challenges and they weren't necessarily uh, handling things or doing things in that space, we did start doing more visual arts. We do have room to do art exhibitions. We actually one of our partners is the Romeo Bearden Foundation. They do a lot of their lectures and their talks here at HSA now.
Mm.
So it's what I look at us now, Greg, is really HSA. We keep Harlem School of the Arts as the name because that's what our founder named us, and we feel that legacy is important to uphold. But we really are a cultural center. We are an art center.
Yeah, I just want to interject also. This show was born at the Harlem School of the Arts because there was a panel there that the Bearden Foundation had, where the panel was to discuss the Cinque Gallery beginnings and what have you in the history. And I was on the panel with Susan Stedman, and we happened to be chosen then to work on this project because in the audience was a woman by the name of Genevieve Martin, who was working at the time at the Art Students League. And she said, oh, we've got to do this. We have to have a show of some of the alums of Zinke Gallery. And so it really started because of, again, the Bearden Foundation having this panel right there at the Harlem School of the Arts. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, just to satisfy my curiosity, Eric, just what is the number of the student body at the school currently? And I'm assuming that students are selected or apply from all 5 boroughs.
We serve probably, pre-COVID, over 1,000 kids a year.
Okay.
But they come in sort of different cohorts. We have our general population. There's no application. You sign them up. It's not about special talent. It's about, because I think, one of the things we have to dispel is that a lot of times people would come here, oh, my daughter or son, they dance and they this, that, and the other. I always tell people, we don't teach people math because they're going to become mathematicians. It's because they need math and they need to know it. And I think for me, the arts is no different. That was the spirit in which Ms. Maynard founded HSA.
Mm-hmm.
We need our children to be exposed to creative problem solving, critical thinking, mastering communication, learning how to work collaboratively. And there's just no better platform than the arts for that. So that's the number that we serve per year. Of course, we've been impacted, like everyone with the COVID crisis. A brick and mortar like us, who were bringing everybody into the building, everything had to be pivoted to online. But that's the amount. And then we have what we call our college and career prep program. These are young people who they want to go to Juilliard, they want to go to Berkeley, they want to be professionals. My mentor, what I call my art father, was Al Loving. I came to New York City, and because he took me and his son to places like Cinque, and that's where I met the Adgers and the Nanettes and other folks. And it influenced me so much that I went back. I was on full scholarship playing basketball and was a business major. Went back to Georgia, changed my major, and eventually walked away from my scholarship to pursue a career in the arts because of that type of exposure.
Mm-hmm.
And so that had a tremendous impact. And then another person had an influence was Frank Bowling.
Mm-hmm.
I heard, Frank, they had shared a story. Frank had a piece of art and then a divorce. The art sort of found its way on the street and somehow somebody rescued the work. And it just made me think about, probably similar to Ms. Maynard, we're going to have legacy in our culture. Some of us are going to have to deal in spaces like arts education. Some of us are going to have to be arts administrators, and some of us are going to have to be artists. But if we don't think about it in terms of the whole ecosystem, we will get lost in the shuffle, and other people will make the choices of who, which of our artists should be lifted or seen, or, which work should be, put a microphone in front of it, or a light in front of it, or gallery walls behind it.
Yeah. Well, Adger, I definitely want to bring you in, my brother.
Right.
Yes. And, of course, to talk about the founding of Kamoinge and the principals who were involved and what you guys' intentions were in coming together.
Well, first of all, I studied photography at Ohio University from 1954 to 58. At that time, photography was not an art. Photography was not even considered an art until 1979, when Ansel Adams was on the cover of Time magazine, and all of a sudden, photography was an art. When I came to New York and tried to get shows in galleries, they rejected me. The Cinque Gallery showed mostly sculptors and painters. They did not show photography. Nobody showed photography at that time. So I went uptown and I met Ray, and he said, I had a picture in 1963. I had a picture of Louis Armstrong on the cover of Theater magazine. And Ray called me and said, I saw your picture. He said, you're a professional photographer and you're black. I said, and he said, well, could you come uptown and talk? We got a little group up here, Camera 35, and we're doing photography. So I went uptown, and they were amateurs at that time, a lot of them. Lou Draper was the only person who had some professional training besides him and myself. So we started showing guys how to use a light meter, how cameras, lenses, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And so one day at one of the meetings, they said, well, what are we going to do? I said, and Lou felt the same way and all the guys said, they're doing such negative pictures of us. He said, they're all negative. He said, that's what I liked about your picture of Louis Armstrong. He said, it's a photograph and he looks like a serious musician. He's not grinning and smiling, et cetera. I said, yeah, well, that's very important. So we decided that we would take on the mantle of showing positive images of our people. Photography was important to push, the art of photography. But what was more important for us at that time was to do pictures of our people in positive ways. No more this tires and bullshit. We wanted to have, and because we came from that. I mean, the family that I came from a very proud Black family. I didn't grow up in the hood. I don't know anything about that until I came to New York. So my idea of being a photographer was to be a photographer, not to be a Black photographer or to be this kind of photographer, but to be a photographer, So, and my studies, I studied with Clarence H. White Jr., who was Clarence H. White's senior son, who was part of Stieglitz's Gallery 291. So my training in photography was about personal expression. It wasn't about anything else. It was about photography. And my mother was an amateur photographer. My uncle was an amateur photographer. So I came from that kind of background. My mother played piano, all this stuff. So we got together and we decided that we would, band together and do these positive images. And that's basically what we're still doing. I'm the president now. They wanted me to be president a long time. I didn't want to be president, too much work. But now we're in the process of forming as a business and buying a building so that, we don't get lost in the shuffle, because we found that in owning something, then you could talk about some kind of history. I mean, when Roy came in, Roy helped us get a gallery in 141st Street, I think it was. And we would have little shows up there, but none of the artists would come. It was all photographers. Very few of the artists came. But see, you have to remember, I'm 10 years older than most of y'all, maybe a little more. So you guys came along later on. But before, there was nothing happening. But I felt that we had to have some kind of group who, were in the Black community. We were in Harlem, and I just felt that that was important. So that's how, Kamoinge started. And now we have lots of women. Ming was the first woman to come into the group, but it wasn't a thing like we're taking in Ming as a woman. This is a big deal. It wasn't. Everybody was a photographer, and Ming was treated like everybody else as a photographer. She wasn't treated as a Black woman who joined a group of men. They did the same thing with Africa, where everybody talked about Africa being a group for men only, but it wasn't. 3 of the founding members of Africa were women. So Ming came in the group not as the first woman, she was, but she came in. Actually, she was Tony's girlfriend, and she used to hang out with him all the time. And she would come to the meetings and be talking about photography. She got interested, and her and Tony would go out and shoot together. So it was like that, and nobody at that time was showing photography in any of these galleries. The first show I had in New York was with the Heliography Gallery, which was a gallery was down on where were we? Lexington Avenue in the 60s. And this was a group of photographers who felt that photography was an art. And you had to have work that was artistic to be in the group, et cetera, et cetera. But that was the first show that I had in New York. And that group, the heliographers are not even in the history books. Paul Caponegro and Jerry Ullsman, all these guys who became famous in the world of, I'll say, white photography, didn't exist. Photography wasn't art. We used to argue at the Art Students League, as a matter of fact, with other artists, about photography being an art. And they would say, no, you guys get out of it. That is not art. That's a craft, and, it's not an art. Yeah. And then Ansel Adams sold that photograph. And I think in 1970, he got $1,500 for it. Everybody went crazy. The whole world of art and photography and painting and all that went crazy. And then that's how all that happened. And then the galleries came to Cinque, and Peg Austin had a little gallery showing African art. And I went up there and we had classes to tell people what art was all about, photography, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It came. We didn't have a show. We helped build the Studio Museum in Harlem. We went up there and put in paint and wood, et cetera. They didn't give us a show, not until Ed Spriggs gave the first show of the Africover and the Kamoinge photographers. All this stuff came out of the 60s, basically, because people were saying, we're not going to do this anymore, And so these places started opening up, and now it's, you would think it's always been here, the art world of African-American artists showing work. Well, they, it's got a ball rolling now. And then after this brother was killed on national television, I mean, everybody started exploding. Oh, we got to do something about Black art, blah, 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 photography, painting. But anyway, to come back to the gallery situation and what happened and the change that happened after the Black arts movement, everybody came together. The artists, the photographers, the painters, the poets, we all started realizing that what we had was important. Still, the museums and galleries weren't showing us. Very few were showing in what was considered, A-class galleries, because there was nothing in Harlem. There was nothing anywhere, and so the Cinque was a beacon, it was years before I had a show at, I think it was in the 70s, I had a show at Cinque. And it wasn't photography, it was some of my print work and paintings. But then later on, Tony Barboza and a couple other artists had shows at the Cinque when we were down on Broadway at that time. And then, things started changing. Everybody was, I don't know, it was a hodgepodge in the 50s when I came here. 54, 55. It was a hodgepodge. There were no solid groups of artists working together. And then, I learned about Romy much later because of a show I had at the NAACP Gallery, and he came and Frank was there. And then after that, we were all tight. This whole part that you're talking about here now, happened in the 60s, in the late 60s and the 70s and on. But before that, in the 50s, man, there's nothing happening in photography or painting. Dance was the big thing. Dance and what else? Dance and theater, and then things started kind of happening up to the level they are now.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to hear you guys also just talk about some of the other organizations or institutions or entities that came into being in that area that were part of the kind of the organizing thrust impulse. I'm specifically thinking of Kinkilliba House, and then Linda Bryant just above Midtown, who were instrumental in bringing me to New York for my first job in the arts here.
Yeah, well, Linda.
I'm sure there are others that that.
Yeah, but Linda was important.
Kelly Gallery, I was thinking, so
yeah, but Linda was important because she jumped out there on 57th Street and said she was going to show black art. Well, they tried to kill her. She was going to show art.
That was 77, right?
Yeah. Now I look. Mean Smith and Linda were kids. When I was 14, they were little girls. And they would come, we all grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and they would come into the drugstore where I worked. Mean's father was a pharmacist in that drugstore. And I was a soda jerk, making hamburgers and stuff. And they would come in there, Linda and her little hot posse, always had a little posse of girls, and they would come in there and hang out, So I knew her from way, way back. So when she jumped out there on 57th Street, everybody was like, what? But it took a lot of nerve and a lot of bravery to do what she did. And she was successful at it.
Yeah.
But that helped also, to see that this art by African Americans, well, I didn't like that term. I still don't. I'm not an African American. I'm a black man who grew up in America. I think that all of that, Peg Austin, there was a couple of Where We At women in Brooklyn, and all these little groups are happening all over. And I think that all of that together helped bring us to where we are now.
I'd like to interject and just say also in the 60s, we had the founding of El Museo de Barrio.
Right.
We had Dance Theater of Harlem. And so it was a very rich and productive time. And I like to think of it as coming on the heels of, Brown versus Board of Education, the 50s movement.
All of that.
So politically, things were changing. The beauty of all of this, of course, was that several of these institutions started in Harlem, which is really quite amazing. And so it was just a very vital time. There was a lot of verve and energy and excitement.
We've talked about, the phrase where we are now, but where are we now in terms of how you guys read the situation for particularly emergent Black artists?
Well, I think that the field is opened up. I think women are the flavor right now. And I think that a lot of young artists who are graduating from Yale and Harvard are getting shows. And because of all the stuff that's happening. And I think that because of all that's happening political, a lot of young artists, I think, are being underserved, because they're having these great shows because they won a prize somewhere and they graduated from Yale or Harvard, and they have some degrees, but they're not standing on the shoulders the way we stood on the shoulders of our ancestors. They're talking about it, the importance of African American art and the importance of Black art. But I just feel that the quality of the work is not, it's not there to me. You know, I could be wrong, you know, maybe I'm not seeing it the way people are seeing it, but I've listened to a lot of the younger artists talk about their work. You can't talk about, you have to show the work. When you start explaining a visual image too much, then I think you lose something about the vision of what the work is. You know, the visual arts, you know, it's about, you can't talk a picture.
You know, just in terms of where we are now, I think that, and I'm going to just look at it through a lens of Harlem. And as we are in 2020, or, you know, we are right at the centennial of what the Harlem Renaissance and what gave birth to all this culture that we have here in Harlem. And I would say right now, when I look at there is a Renaissance today, it's an institutional Renaissance. And I think that if we are going to control our narrative, it's going to be because we have healthy institutions like Cinque who are given a stable enough foundation to where you can bring people in, and that evolution that Adger's talking about has an opportunity to happen. You know, because if you don't have the places where you can workshop things. And also, we got to remember New York City now. I mean, New York is about real estate. Let's be clear. You know, whether you renting it or owning it, it's a real estate driven town. And right now, not just in the Black art scene, even in the mainstream art community, white art community, artists can't afford to live in New York the way they did before, to have workspace in New York City. So when I look at HSA in a role we play and how we use our studio space, you know what I mean? And the fact that, you know, we can work with emerging artists, work with artists, you know, musicians, playwrights, you know, actors, dancers, and provide them potential platform, because it's going to be difficult otherwise for them to have that type of space. So I look at and think where we are now is that we've got to recognize the value that our institutions play, because when we look at a Cinque, we need Cinque still to this day. I mean, even if you look at the portrait of Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, you're talking about two former Studio Museum in Harlem residents. You know, so I mean, so the value that comes out of having a place, a platform for our artists to be able to come out of, that never gets old. And what we have to do is, I think what we talking about with Cinque is a cautionary tale that we need to understand and not let happen again.
Right.
You know, that when we have that kind of, you know, institution with that history, you know, and I hear a lot of people, they make it and all of a sudden they want to, you know, I'm not against starting something new, but I think we have to understand what we have that has legacy already attached to it, and build on that, and not just throw stuff away, and not just embrace, you know, that, you know, call it Western or American concept of it's old, so let's get rid of it, you know, and recognize that no, it's legacy. Let's sustain it. Let's, you know, support it. Because particularly for us, and I'll end here and saying with our children, you know, because arts are taken out of our schools, it's still to this day, you know, so our kids now, some of our young, when I say ours, I'm talking about broader Black community children, don't know the history of Romare Beard and don't know, you know, our great playwrights, you know, August Wilson. They don't know some of these things. And, you know, so it's incumbent upon us to sustain these institutions and make certain that those people who are collecting art and that sort of thing, to recognize it's good to collect. The chances of the value of that work goes up if we're cultivating future generations of collectors, art historians, writers, and critics. And that happens because we maintain an ecosystem of culture in our community. That means we have to have Zinke Gallery and institutions like it, Harlem School of the Arts. You talked about places in the 60s. Arts Carnival started in the 60s. Studio Museum, National Black Theater started in the 60s. Jazzmobile was in the 60s.
Yeah, right.
It's a bunch of them, you know, and, you know, we need to recognize and make certain that we learn from this conversation and make certain that we do what we can to make certain that our institutions don't perish. Cinque is something that should still be here to this day, and we cannot let that happen again.
Greg, I'm wondering, what are the communities that you're seeing on the art scene now? Is this all on Instagram? Is this on Twitter or TikTok? Where are you seeing the young people coming together, or any institutions that are really helping young visual artists outside of Harlem School of the Arts?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think in terms of the patrons, in terms of the audience, for Black artists and then for younger Black artists, I mean, they definitely communicate with each other through social media, Instagram and Twitter and so forth. And they go to shows, they post about them, they write them, they have blogs, I mean, that their grassroots is digital, I think maybe the generation that came, and it's really not even a full generation, but like the artists that and artist supporters that started to emerge in the late 90s were really the last generation who really came together, like in the public sphere, in the streets and so forth, I mean, through music and through finding each other and supporting each other at events like Black Rock Coalition events, and then later Afro-punk events, but certainly when I think about where the action is in terms of visual arts for younger people, I mean, it's definitely online.
I just want to thank everyone for joining us today for this lively, informative gathering. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Nanette.
Thank you.
Thank you.